I encourage everyone to take a moment and breathe and take a tea cheers with a Jiri tea. A Jiri tea recognizes the beauty in shared stories and shared opportunities. Ajiri sources award-winning tea from Kenya, employs women in the region to handcraft the labels, and sends 100% of the profits back to the region to support orphan education. Save 10% on your order of Kenyan teas and coffee with the code BeautifullyHuman at ajiritea.com. AJIRIT.com. Tea mugs up. Hello and welcome to the Beautifully Human podcast. I'm Nick Sheesby. In this podcast, I speak with beautiful humans from all around the world, sharing with you their incredible stories, revealing the power in every human story, to spread love and humanity to a world that is in desperate need of it, to show that we can all connect in beautiful ways, no matter where we come from or what we look like. What you will find out is that we are all beautifully human. Let's all be beautifully human. Hello and welcome back to the Beautifully Human podcast. Thanks for tuning in wherever you are in this beautiful world. Today I am hanging out with Muna Ikedion, and we have an amazing conversation just about where life takes you, where you grow up, where you end up, the differences you can make in those places, even if it's not immediate, and just a lot of different, amazing, beautiful parts to this conversation. So if you enjoy this podcast, follow along on Instagram at the Beautifully Human Podcast, rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And as always, enjoy this beautiful conversation. So I love to start these conversations off with a very broad and overarching question and just ask you to tell me the story of your life.
Yeah, the story of my life. I mean, it that could be a long, long, drawn out story. I tend to be like super specific and over detailed, but when I think about like the story of my life or my origin story, as I like to call it, or what I like to ask people, I think about these key moments or these key themes that built me to where I am now. And first and foremost, it's based on location. So I was technically born and raised in Oklahoma. And then when I was a teenager, moved to Tennessee. And then after graduating college, I moved to New York City. So those are kind of the big markers of the three phases of life. And I often say Oklahoma is where I grew older, but Tennessee is where I grew up, because those like it was a world of a difference. In Oklahoma, I was lived in a military town, went to a very, very small private Christian school.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Felt like I was like when I look back on it, it feels like I was trying to like replicate a life I saw on TV, of what I
Yeah.
thought of like the private school cool like mean girl life was. And then when I moved to Tennessee, which was an awakening and probably the most exciting and informative time of my life. I was in like the middle of nowhere, rural Tennessee, at a huge public school in the kind of environment where it was like not unusual for, people to be wearing, you know, cowboy boots and overalls and like flannels as like a very unironic just life. Like that didn't feel abnormal to me until
Sure.
I moved to like New York, and that was like cosplay for people.
Yeah.
um, so that environment was really interesting in what I would like to construct the real world, and having some of the highest highs and lowest lows in that environment, in small town rural Tennessee, and then later on moving to Nashville, which is the biggest city, I believe, in Tennessee, and very metropolitan compared to that. And it was because, in one way, I felt like outsider, other. I mean, I was a Black girl, Nigerian, very Nigerian name, came from a large family, wasn't used to what is considered, Southern traditions or Southern life. but it also was the first time I felt like I didn't have to pretend. Like I really actually, like personality wise, fit in with a lot of what small town life and ideals were. So it really ended up shaping me into what who I am now in New York, and I think that ended up being a great fit for what New York has to offer and being unapologetically yourself. I
Yeah.
think that the US South gets a lot of a bad rep on television and media of like what people think the South is. And I think that there's very conscious of that when you're in the South. So being able to live that life and be unapologetically like that kind of person, right, who wears cowboy boots to the grocery store because you just, finished doing whatever you were doing that legitimately needed cowboy boots.
Sure.
That kind of like owning who you are and not feeling shame was a really important part of that experience. And then also just being around quote unquote normal people. And I say normal people, which is not maybe a fair assessment, but people of all walks of life who also, again, didn't pretend. When I look back at the time I was in private school, and my assessment was that everyone was rich. Everyone came from a similar kind of upbringing. Everyone came from a similar set of family values. But in reality, like if I'm being honest, and now with like my adult perspective, that probably isn't the case. But we were all playing the same character, so we all believed that we were the same kind of people. And that wasn't the case in Tennessee, or my experience there throughout my teen and young adult life. So I really got to see what it looked like for some of my closest friends to be living in poverty and never having felt comfortable that there would be food on the table at night, in the same way that you could see people who lived in these gigantic mansions and 16-bedroom homes, and parents owned 17 cars. It was really a spectrum, but it never felt like one group was better than the other. It was just like, this is the world, this is life.
Mm.
Like we are a microcosm of the world in this small town. So I kind of found my place of authentically kind of being in this weird in between of being a girl who liked like fashion and like super like girly things, but also I was an intense STEM student, and like over intellectualized the most basic things. And then also someone who really cared about like human emotion and mental health. And I know that's like a very current thing to be talking about, but like definitely
Yeah.
not back then, especially not
Oh,
in the environment
yeah.
um, I was in, of really, being open and authentic about that, and kind of introducing those concepts to my friends and family, and also being really passionate about like social justice in a way that, like, again, I look back at how brave I was. Like that person who I was then at 17 is not who I am now. The things I would say and do and the conversations I would spark in a room full of very traditional, very conservative, very white, very, Southern values, very male, very all of these things. And I would feel so like open and comfortable to like push back, which again is not what people think of at the South. And I, of course, put some of it to my bravery, but also just like the kind of cultural environment I was in, um, where it wasn't as if when those moments happened, um, I felt like in psychological or physical danger, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, so, so that all kind of leads to, or I guess, in the story of my life of, you know, um, being the kind of person that very conscientiously knew that like this, like I was like living my formative years. Like it's again, like it was like almost like I knew like this was like shaping who I was.
Yeah.
So by the time I had gone to college and was in Nashville with people who very much viewed like college as the time where you were shaping your life, I felt like that was my time to fully practice my full self on people who didn't
Mm.
know me. Like I kind of, this was who I was, this is who I am. Like let me be authentically me in a way that I've already developed it, and let's show the world or show these new friends or these new people who it is, um, and kind of tweak it and evolve it and take in information and take in new perspectives that would then adjust who I was, but wouldn't create or shape who I was. And that, and I'm fortunate for that, especially in college, because college is traumatic for a lot of people.
Sure. Yeah.
College was traumatic for me, in a lot of ways. And I think if I didn't come in with a sense of self, I don't think I would have survived it in the way that I had. And I have friends who didn't survive it in more ways than one. And that I think is um, a really key part of adulthood, I think, and even the disparity that we see nowadays with, I know with in the corporate world, we, talk about burnout professionally, and just society and in life, just the doomsday feeling we have. I think it goes back to resiliency and like how rooted we feel in our sense of self, our sense of purpose, our sense of belonging. And having developed that at such a young age, and then testing that out or having put through that fire at a young age as well, but through college and in those early years, I feel so much more comfortable and confident now, in the quote unquote real world, that um, that like I will be okay, right? Like I know who I am. Like I don't have like I'm not questioning, my core values or my sense of self, or I don't have this, even if it's not okay, it's still okay, right? Because that's
Hmm.
just life.
Yeah.
So I like to think of it all as a chiseling or a shaping of the still unfinished, of course, version of myself now. Um, but yeah, I think that's I guess how I would describe my origin story or kind of the story of my life that um, preceded or set up the current form of who I am.
I love that. Um, so I had a couple questions as you were going through. Um, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, and I was having very different life as as we all do. But I love how you're saying that you were having these conversations among like white men and all these things. Like when you brought that up, because it's something I think about a lot when I try to talk to people that have or definitely have differing views than myself, and I don't see it necessarily going super well, or even just having a two-way conversation. Do you feel like when you were that young and you were asking and like pushing and like prying into these conversations, do you feel that it was something that was like made people think, or they, I don't know. I like to think that when I bring these things up to people and I try to like push back, that it helps a little bit. So
Yeah.
how did you feel when you were in those situations, or do you feel like you got some movement with it?
Well, I will say that the world is different now than it was then. I mean, I'm
Totally.
quite young, so it wasn't even that long ago, but even in the past few years, um, in terms of politics specifically, the partisanship is just like it's far beyond what it was when I was in high school. And also this switch of like your beliefs being your beliefs versus your beliefs being your identity.
Yeah.
And that I think is also a shift that
Yeah.
when you are changing nowadays, more so when you're changing your beliefs, you're changing your perspective, it feels like you're changing who you are. And back to what I was saying in my kind of the origin story part of it is that it's really difficult to do that, and it can be very jarring to
Mm,
question who you are and your sense of
totally.
self. So if every time someone is questioning your belief system and that belief system is synonymous in your mind or in your heart of hearts with like who you are, that is very difficult. And I feel like that can be challenging to make headway. Not to say that you can't, and I think that planting seeds is usually like the way that I go about it, especially nowadays, of just like maybe it's just one tidbit or one drop that kind of gets them to ponder like after the conversation. But at the time, I did feel like um, I was giving people a new perspective, or there was some shift that was happening. And I feel that way for two reasons. One, again, I being like there's this perception, and even that I still sometimes have to catch myself in, of when I think of rural Tennessee, what it looks like. And at the beginning of this year, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade.
Yeah.
And I don't go on Facebook, like I don't like post on Facebook, but I go on Facebook often. I'm not sure, it's like just force of habit.
Sure.
I go
Yeah,
on
yeah,
to
totally.
Facebook.com like maybe once a week just to kind of see what's going on, especially with people I grew up with that I don't follow on any other social platform. And it was shocking to me how many people who I had gone to school with or grew up with who, by all intents and purposes, on paper, are extremely conservative, extremely right wing, but are then sharing these really nuanced takes on what abortion access means in the United States. And of course, I'm not going to, and I really can't take credit for that. But again, someone 10 years later being able to have that view oftentimes can start from one conversation
Totally.
or a couple conversations that happened when they were in those formative years. And on top of that, I think for me, I always took this model that I actually learned from my youth pastor, because growing up, I went to church a lot. Like I was like a 3 day a week going to church kind of kid.
Same.
And which there's a specific kind of person that does. I had a friend in college. He was like, kids go to church on Wednesday? I'm like, yes, absolutely. What do you mean? You didn't go to youth group?
Right.
So that was the kind of kid I was. And this church I went to, which was very modern, compared to some of the churches my friends went to. But I remember one of the most impactful services I ever went to was my youth pastor talking about this spectrum of evangelicals or just Christianity and what it means to kind of convert someone, and that it's really like a relay race, that it's not your job to take like the absolute atheist all the way to like the disciple of God, or the like what your job is to get them through the door, like, invite them to church, right? And they come to church, and it's someone else's job to like make sure they have a good time, and that there's someone else's job to make sure they come back, and then just make sure that like they do like each step, and you really are in charge of like you're one part of that relay. So when I think about that, I kind of apply it to different conversations or different parts of my life. And when it comes to these more contentious conversations, that's kind of how I think about it. And that's what I thought about in high school, was that it's not my job to take you from like right to left.
Sure.
My job is to get you from like where you are to just like open that door enough that when the sunlight comes in, you're like, whoa, it's actually, the weather is so much nicer outside. Like it just, it just need to kind of shift your view a little bit and kind of adjust like a prism. And like you just need like that little bit to get, and then hope, pray, set up an ecosystem where there's someone afterwards or someone along those lines who can then push it a little bit further. So I felt that was actually really really helpful and really impactful. And some of maybe the most like intense conversations I had, like I wouldn't say they were good ones, and they're not people I want to like keep in touch with or haven't kept in touch with per se. Right. So I can't really confirm if it worked out or it didn't.
Yeah.
But I know that there's certain arguments or certain approaches that can be made and that I typically take that are just undeniable. Like you can't, like, unless you're being like intentionally obtuse, like you can't like shove it, to the side and like ignore it. So it was enough that I know that like they held on to at least some of it. And if someone used that same verbiage or brought up that same point down the road, like it would click, like something, like they would make that connection. So yeah.
Yeah, I know. I think about that a lot, and I like that the way you took it. But I just like thinking of like a little ripple. Like you touch one person, and then like it just kind of like ripples out and just keeps going and going. Yeah, it's got to be interesting too. Like coming from somewhere super small, then moving to somewhere else super small, then going to Nashville, which I lived in Nashville for a while, so I know the environment there, and then I know New York City really well too. When you got there, how did you feel? Was it easy to adapt because you had just like gone from different environment to different environment, or how was it getting there?
New York or Nashville?
New York.
So I will say I don't feel like I hopped around that much as a child, even because they're marked by those locations, in part because I grew up in a military town. Like I spent most of my life around people who moved every 2 years. So to me, staying somewhere a long time, like me having only lived in 3 places before New York, felt like super like I've stayed put. Like this is normal, right? So in that sense, it wasn't necessarily that I felt as if that it was kind of like a different step along this path, because I came to New York thinking I would stay a long time. Like I mean, I still hope to be here for a long time. But it never felt quite different because it was still so gradual. Like going from, when I was in rural Tennessee, I was in a town of about 20,000 people. And then Nashville, which is, I think 1.5 million metro population. And then of course, New York, that's like 8 million plus. So it was enough of um, a progression, which when I say those numbers doesn't sound like a progression, but it was enough of a progression that it felt a little normal. And then really, I mean, if I'm being completely honest, I think when I moved to New York, I kind of surprised a lot of people in my life, including my family. Like my parents were confused, my siblings were confused, and everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, you're so brave! You're like, going out and doing this thing." But in my mind, I had graduated college. I wanted to work in the fashion industry, and that's where you go, right? I had interned in Nashville, and the people I had interned with had previously lived in New York and told me to move to New York. And to me, that's like, well, I have no choice then. Like that's where the jobs are. That's where the people are. And it's been romanticized so much in my life when you watch, The Devil Wears Prada or Gossip Girl or all these other shows that talk about, the fashion industry. So when I came, it didn't even feel like much of an adjustment because it was the same way like me moving to Nashville for college was like I'm going to college, so I'm in this bigger city, but it's because it's where the college I wanted to go to was. So Nashville's or New York it's where the job I wanted or the industry I wanted was. So it didn't actually feel like that much of an adjustment, and I had the extreme benefit of like a lot of people I went to school with. Like New York is a huge like migration city for them. So a lot of people that I've gone to school with were also there. So it wasn't as if I was like on my own, like trying to make my way and figuring it out.
Yeah. So how is it? Are you working in the fashion industry now?
Technically, but not in the way I thought I was going to be. I still work in fashion and beauty and wellness and a little bit in the entertainment. But what's so interesting to me, and I think back to my younger self and like what I wanted to do when I quote unquote grew up, was I remember like I confided in one friend when I was in college, and I said my dream job was I wanted to be the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion for a fashion company.
Yeah.
But I didn't think the world was ready for that. So that was going to be a goal I had for 20 years down the line. Because most people, if you ask them what a head of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is at that time, they would have been confused, or they would have been like, "Oh, that's cool," but they wouldn't think of it as like an actual job field.
Right.
So I had an interest in creative things. I'm not a creative person. I was definitely more of like the analytical, like business side of things. But I wanted to be around creative people or creative things. So my goal was to go and work in fashion. And the easiest way to get into fashion in New York is like through PR and marketing. And then eventually, when the world had shifted enough and it felt like there was a place for people to speak openly about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I would then, pursue that role and be advanced enough in my career to be the head of diversity and inclusion, like Gucci or something.
Yeah.
But like a year into my career, which was summer of 2020, George Floyd is murdered, and all of a sudden, diversity, equity, inclusion becomes like the most popular phrase in fashion.
Yeah.
And at the time, I was working at a fashion business strategy agency that did PR and business strategy for fashion adjacent clientele. And I spoke up to my boss and I said, just so you know, this feels like a sign, because this is actually what I've always wanted to do. Like this area that I thought no one would ever, like fashion can be so archaic in some senses. Like I felt like they would never be having these conversations, at least not this soon. Like I feel like this is an opportunity that I can then like again like get that wedge, that door is now open, that I can have these conversations and kind of do what I've always wanted to do. And my boss at the time was really supportive of that. And so essentially, like I consider myself that I mostly work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mostly work in social impact, but I have a personal preference for fashion, beauty, wellness, entertainment, because that's what I like. And I also feel like that's where those conversations seem to happen in the most superficial way, or like the least, there's the least amount of depth. and how they happen, but they also have the most impact. Like we cannot deny that media and fashion and the beauty industry have had a huge impact in how we see equity in our lives or
Yeah.
inclusion in our lives. So it felt like the best of both worlds. And so I guess technically, I guess to answer your question, I do still work in fashion, but it feels disingenuous to say that.
Sure. But that's super cool that you're getting to kind of hit your goal way quicker than you thought you would then, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it also feels like, again, it feels so weird to think about my younger self who felt like it was a dirty little secret to say that. I was always like social impact oriented. I was really outspoken about, political stances and my like social justice and my values. So I'm not sure. I think that there was something that felt like a little bit weird about like that being a career choice versus just like again a belief system or something that like I can have a conversation about. Um, and also, it was hard for me to assess like what the real world was like. Like in the same way that I think that the small towns I grew up in were perceived to be very, very conservative. I also knew that their actuality, they were probably, well, it felt like more diverse than the real world. Like I grew up with a very diverse group of friends, or the closest people in my life. Were all very different from each other. So part of me is like, well, maybe I'm just living in this like pseudo world where like that's not a thing because I've seen on TV and I've watched these movies that have no people who look like me, or when they are about race, it's about how racist the world is. Like it wouldn't there was no sense for me to be able to see that like it was even um a viable career. So now that I'm in the job, yes, I am glad I'm reaching that goal sooner, but I'm also questioning why I didn't feel like I could get it as soon as I could in theory. There are diversity, equity, inclusion departments and consultants and things like that even before 2020 and before George Floyd was murdered. But I just didn't see it, or I didn't feel like it
Sure.
was real. So it's kind of like a congrats, but also why was the limitation there in the first place?
Sure, yeah.
So
No, I can
yeah.
understand that. It makes me wonder too, just because I'm thinking drawing similarities to just like small towns and just like differing ideals and people that you grew up with. Um, is your family on the more conservative side? So like when you were growing up and you were forming these thoughts and all of that, like what do you think was like the biggest motivator, and was your family the same, or were you like aligned on things, or were you kind of the one that was like taking a stand like opposite?
So there's no I wouldn't there I don't have a clear assessment of my family. One, because there's seven of us, so I have four siblings, then both of my parents. Um and we all kind of formed our own belief systems and value systems, and they're all similar because we all run the same household, but it still kind of was informed by our outside of home life. It's also shifted. When I was young, like when we were all living in the same household, I definitely was the most progressive. Like I would get in these like fights or these like hours long conversations, like educating my siblings about things um that ironically like they now like educate their friends on as if they had that belief the entire time. And there have been times where I get a little bit resentful that like I felt like I was in like on my own island, felt like I was you know fighting against like my entire family about certain things that they weren't quite on board with. Um, but I would say that now we are more similar in our belief system. But my parents, especially my dad growing up, was like the classic, like older Black viewpoint. And yes, he was Nigerian and both of my parents were immigrants. But I saw Van Jones speak in college, and he said something along the lines of um, that a lot of older Black people are conservative, but they don't vote Republican because of the disrespect. And I felt like that was really impactful because it's true. There's a lot of communities of color have very conservative values,
Sure.
but the rampant racism that tends to run through the Republican Party has alienated them.
Yeah.
So in that instance, my dad and I had very different views on a lot of things growing up, which I always was confused by because I'm like, aren't you were also Black and you are also and you are an immigrant. Like this is very odd to me.
Yeah.
But it's actually not that unusual generationally for older Black folks to hold more conservative values. So that a lot of those were also losing battles though. It's like it's a lot more difficult to like have those kind of fights with your parents.
Sure.
And there are times where I had them, but there were some of them were just so steadfast and just felt so like unfounded that it didn't even feel worthwhile. But for my siblings, I think that we've all kind of hopefully kind of moved towards a more empathetic viewpoint. Um, I have a brother who's 18 though, and he's a little bit I don't like he's I question what the average 18-year-old boy living in the South is,
Sure.
you know, what they're engaging with politically. But also I can give him the grace of knowing that like most 18-year-olds aren't thinking that deeply about a lot of politics. Like I know that at the end of the day, like he grew up with me and we grew up in the same household. So I trust that or I hope at least at the end of the day that there will be some through line between, you know,
yeah.
the decisions he makes
Sure.
and the life he lives.
Yeah. And also I'm thinking about your parents. And I had a conversation with someone on the podcast ages ago. It was I can't even remember when, but I was talking about like the American dream. Did you ever like talk to your parents about like what that looked like in like the grandiose, like, ooh, the American dream versus like, you know, like Instagram versus reality moments? Have you had those conversations?
A little bit. And I actually like I think about that a lot now because that comes up a lot these days. I see it on social media and the way people talk about it. And I think I think I tend to have a controversial view of this, but I think that people's understanding of the American dream is very different in the US versus what they're understanding the American dream to be outside of the US. Sure. And I can definitely acknowledge the systemic barriers and like just the inability, especially for people who were born and generationally been in the US, to achieve this American dream that has been sold to us. But to really grasp the American dream, it requires to understand how different the economic systems are in other countries. That it is it is very unlikely for the average American to become a millionaire, right?
Right.
In other countries, it is impossible, right? The difference between unlikely versus impossible is where the American dream lives, right? That there are some people who knew that it was impossible, like no matter how hard they worked, no matter what all these different things happened, it just wasn't an option. And that I think is where I tend to see the conversation where what's missing in the conversation nowadays is not understanding, I guess, like the plight or the environment that a lot of immigrants came into, right? So there's that. But I think my parents had a very different experience, or at least I grew up having a very different experience. I'm not sure if it's because the narrative that we hear the most in media or on social media or on TV is just one note and there's more diverse perspectives out there that aren't just being heard, or that my parents were the exception. But like my parents never told the story of like coming here with nothing and starting from scratch. Like my mom was considerably wealthy when she was in Nigeria. And my dad came to the US because he had finished medical school and practicing in the US is much more lucrative as a doctor than it is in Nigeria. So it never for me felt as if like this huge sacrifice that was being made and that they were giving up their life to give us a life. It was more so that they came to have their best life.
Sure.
And then they ended up having children who also got to have a good life too. So it never, I don't like it feels a little, I don't know, homogenous, I think, in the way that the American dream and the immigrant story is told. Sure. And I would really love to hear more of the stories of people who immigrated by choice. And I say by choice because like there are some people who go back to the country they came from. Like my dad passed away last year, but he was in Nigeria. He had retired and gone back to Nigeria.
Mm.
And there are a lot of people, especially Nigerians, who come from all sorts of economic backgrounds and also become very successful while being in the United States. So I feel like there's more to the story to be told of
Yeah.
what achieving the American dream looks like, especially when um, it comes to those who like didn't quote unquote sacrifice everything
Mm.
and
Yeah.
come here with nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really amazing view on it. Um, so did you get to make it, or have you made it to Nigeria before or yet?
Yes, I've been there 3 times. And the last time I was there was just a few months ago. I was there this past summer.
That's amazing. So did you go down to visit your father, or did you just go to visit or check it out?
Um, well, when I went this summer, my father had already passed
Ah,
away, and it
sure.
was more so of um well, one, it was to give him like his traditional official burial, which like I think about so often. Well, one, because of course that's how grief works, right? You think about those moments over and over again.
Yeah.
But it was like not to be cliche, and I really, really hate saying this because it's so like cliche, but it really was life changing in the sense of like it snapped me back into this cultural like into who I knew I was. Moving to New York actually, um, ironically, like I feel like sometimes New York is so diverse in some senses that like your diversity almost doesn't matter. Like I almost like kind of forget that I'm Nigerian, or I don't like I'm not always so consciously aware of it. So going back to my parents' home village and going through these traditional ceremonies and having this several day process of putting someone to rest that is so different from like the American way of doing things.
Yeah.
um Kind of when I got home or I got back to the US, it was so I felt like it almost felt like someone was like validating like you are who you were meant to be. This is like you like not I never thought I was Nigerian. I don't know how to describe this, but like it was like you are Nigerian. You're Nigerian American, but you're Nigerian, right? And like this is where you came from, this is who you are. And it was really enlightening because I never thought I had doubted that. Like I never consciously doubted that, but it was so deeply reaffirmed that I'm like, oh, like this is like this is where my parents came from. This is like the life that they lived, and I can't even. And I kind of wish my dad was alive just to have these conversations between he and my mom because he grew up poor. My mom did not, but they grew up in the same village. And going
Mm.
back to that village, I'm like, this is I would love to know like how you two even interacted
Yeah,
because
totally.
like it's a whole different world, right? So like to this day in the year 2022 that like the electricity gets shut off at like, or there's you don't really have reliable electricity, so you have to use a generator and they shut it off at 7 p.m. to conserve the fuel and that, you if you want to, go to the market, like you're not buying like prepackaged chickens, you're buying a live chicken that you then will have someone like kill and cook. Like it's a very different life than what we know here. And to
Yeah.
imagine both of my parents and their different socioeconomic worlds living that
Yeah.
is fascinating. And I wish I could um, understand more and compare and contrast of what that must have looked like.
Yeah, and I imagine too, even just like them running into each other, being in like money versus not money, and those like here, it just like I'm not in the States, but in the States, like you see it all the time where there's like people who have money and not have money, and they're just like interacting and stuff. But yeah, I can imagine like it's a vastly different system there too on that front.
It's like the LA versus New York. Like someone I
Yeah.
and it's probably apparent that I'm like truly biased towards New York in so many ways compared to other cities.
Yeah.
But it's I loved hearing people talk about like LA versus New York in the sense that because in New York, like most people walk everywhere, most people take the subway, like, even like wealthy people, it's just a more efficient way to get around.
Yeah.
That even the, working class or the people who are just getting by often rub shoulders with, the
Yeah.
upper crust or the upper class in New York, which is very, so that kind of creates a certain environment, a certain kind of people or culture that is very different from LA, where just because you have to drive, like you get in your car, you go to your event, or you go to your thing, and then you meet the people you were supposed to meet, and then you get in your car, and then you go home, and you have your specific neighborhood. That are also the neighborhoods there are very specific, right? That like
Totally.
I'm a very normal average person, but within like however blocks radius that there are like very famous, very wealthy celebrity people who I know live in the same neighborhood I do, which is not as much of the case necessarily in LA. So I feel like it's kind of like that. I wonder if it's like how it compares to those two different
Yeah.
environments of just like how mixed in everyone is in New York versus how segregated things are in LA, which is not to say New York isn't very segregated, because it is,
You're
but
right.
not necessarily in that same way in
No,
terms
totally.
of like social life or just interacting
Yeah.
in society.
Yeah, that's very true. Um, this is a total off topic, but I always ask people on the podcast, and we're talking about different parts of the world. But if I came to you and I had a plane ticket to anywhere in the world, where would you go?
Oh, where would I go?
Yeah, where would you
Oh,
go? If I was just like, you can
I
go
thought you were going to
anywhere.
ask where I would live, and I had an answer for that. But where would I just go to travel? Oh, that's a hard one. Um, oh, that's a hard one. And like, this is where I get to like the overthinking part of me, where I
Mm-hmm.
can't just like have a question be a question. Um, but I've never really been a traveler until this year.
Hmm,
And I've been on like 8 or 9 trips this year for like work and family and other things. So it's kind of given me the travel bug. But beforehand, partially because of the pandemic, but even before
sure.
then, like I like to stay at home. Like I'm a true homebody, like in my actual home, in my actual city, in my actual neighborhood, because I like to know everything before I go anywhere.
Sure.
So that like keeps me from exploring places. Like my first thought was like I would love to go to Tokyo, but like the language barrier would stress me out, right?
Totally.
Or, you know, I would love to go somewhere in Europe, but that feels like too basic that so many people do that. So I'm like, oh, that wouldn't be fun.
Yeah.
Um, and I would want to go somewhere in South America, but I'm not familiar enough with the culture to feel like I would be doing it justice. So like
Sure.
it's hard for me. So if you were like, oh, where would I go? Honestly, my first thought would be like LA, because I like to visit LA. I don't want to live there, but I'm like, that's
Sure.
an easy peasy. Like that's
All right.
that's cool. But if I'm actually like answering the question for what it is and not letting my overactive brain get the best of me, I'd probably say Tokyo.
Yeah. I get that. That is like Japan and Tokyo is probably the most common answer.
Really?
It's the one that comes
Well,
up the most just because it's so different, but like got that big city, so you kind of feel
yeah.
like you could do it, but there's also that like, what the hell is this place?
Yeah. I also feel like it's like decently inaccessible to most people in the US in the sense that when most people in the US travel outside of the country, they're usually going to Europe.
Right.
Um, so I feel like it, like, because I could have said Paris, but I was there last month for the first time, and I'm like, oh, that's easy cop out because I also know French a little bit, so it
Ah,
wasn't
okay.
as intimidating of a trip.
Yeah.
But again, I've already done that, right? So why would I
Yeah.
go somewhere I've already been? So I feel like it's there's so many people who want to go to Tokyo who haven't been, which I think is interesting
Yeah.
in terms of accessibility of travel, especially like to non-European countries.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So you said where would you want to live then, since you said you
Paris.
know that? Paris. All
That
right.
would be that.
Well, it
That
makes
would be
sense with
because
fashion.
well, not even because of the fashion side of it. I thought that would have been what it was, but I've always just been. I think there's a cultural element with my family and being Nigerian. That growing up, you have to pick a second language to learn. Or I'm not sure if that's always been the case, but it definitely has been for the past 10 to 15 years in the school systems I was in. Um, and the most typical language people chose was Spanish. And it always was like a thing that I chose French among my friends or my peers, especially because they felt like there was little to no utility in it. My
Sure.
response was always, I want to work in fashion, first and foremost. But secondly, that's also the second language, well, technically the third, but the foreign language, quote unquote, that my parents learned when they were in school. That
Yeah.
like they grew up speaking their native language of Igbo and also English. So when you go to school, like they don't really have a reason to learn Spanish. Like everyone just learns
Yeah.
French.
Right.
So that felt like that's some kind of connection to me, or it felt very like Nigerian or very like first gen, to be connected to French culture in that way. And also having, and so I always kind of was interested in that sense. And I had made a goal or kind of a wish that I wanted to live in France, for at least a year before I turned 30. And then, and I made that goal probably when I was like 17 or 18. And each year that passed, that felt more and more impractical. But having been there this past month, and I went with a friend who had visited several times before and had spent long stretches, like several weeks there at a time, it now feels so feasible and doesn't feel as intimidating.
Yeah.
And the pace of life there is just so good. Like
So good.
it's like when I went to Nigeria over the summer and I was in my parents' home village, I thought like, oh well, maybe I can like do a dual thing and live in both places because the pace of life there is so. It's like I mean, it's like if New York is on a 100, Paris is on like a 50, like we're there from a Nigeria is like on a 2. Like it's just such a quiet, slow pace of life. But
Yeah.
like, well, this is impractical. Like there's no way I could even get any work done. Like I would have to, like, it wouldn't even work. So Paris feels like that good in between that still feels comfortable and familiar while also still being a challenge and out of my comfort zone.
Yeah. And it's just so whimsical too. It's such a cool city.
Yeah.
And just
Also,
like,
like, do it for the story. Like, I want to like be 60 years old and sitting in a chair and having all of like my kids or my grandkids or my nieces and nephews like think that I'm the most interesting like elder
yeah.
person in my family. Like that's my goal, is to be the most interesting of all my siblings by the time the next generation of our
Yeah.
family comes around.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like how cool of a story, or how like
Totally.
I don't know how much clout I would get for having lived in Paris.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, as much as we all know, this is like the one shot we get at it. So why not? Like
Yeah.
get out there, go see the places you want, live the places you want, just do the things, even if it's just for the stories later. Like that's, life is about experiences. Like we don't take money out of here. We don't take anything else. So why not just like enjoy and see and travel and experience cultures and just, yeah, live it up like that. That's
Yeah.
the best to me. That's the best way to live.
I mean, you're kind of, I feel like, living that in many
Yeah,
ways,
100%.
in your life. So I feel like you've hit the sweet spot.
Yeah. Luckily,
So
I'm very fortunate
yeah,
on that. Yeah,
yeah.
it's
Maybe I'll be.
nice. Yeah. And it is fun to just like have fun, it is fun to have stories and just be able to tell
Yeah,
them and people are like, "What the hell?" And you're like, "Yeah, it's just like, it's like
it's just
you can
normal.
do
Yeah,
it. You can do it."
yeah,
Like it just takes like taking steps and getting outside of your comfort zone and just going and doing it. Like, it is feasible if you just really want to do it.
yeah. That's what I'm trying to. I'm trying to convince myself and tell myself that I it I can be corny with myself sometimes. Like I feel like I can Brene Brown myself, but I'm like, it takes bravery to do this, but you're a brave person. And that's
Yeah.
kind of like my mantra, because it just feels so like I don't know. And even living in New York, like I forget, because I mean obviously living in New York, everyone I am around also lives in New York. So it's not till I go home for like family functions and everyone's like, ooh, the girl from New York is here, and it feels like super impressive. So I feel like
Yeah.
I've done it once. It doesn't feel like it,
Right.
but I've done it once. So why not do it again and
Yeah.
again and again?
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. All right, I have two more questions for you.
okay.
And the first one is, and I know it kind of goes along with what we've been talking about because we've been talking about your life and existence, but this one just kind of takes it a little deeper to and personalizes it to you of just what would you want the world to know about you?
Ooh, what would I want the world to know about me? Oh, hmm. I don't I don't know how I'm supposed to answer this, but the what comes to mind, or what I'm going to answer is that I did my best. I'm doing my best. Um, And maybe I'm saying that to myself. Maybe I'm saying that to the world. Maybe that's how I want to be seen. Um, but um, but yeah, I think that like so many other character traits and personality things, or even just like stories and experiences. When I thought about them, my whole thing was like, oh, I don't care. Everyone needs to know that, right? If someone doesn't get that part of me, like it won't make or break me. But what I would like everyone who meets me or encounters me, or like just everyone in the world to know that like I do my best. I try my best.
Yeah.
I'm the best that I can be at any given moment.
Yeah. And that's massive. Like there's some people that don't do that. So the fact that you're out there doing that is that's important, you know? And it's a good message to put out there. Just do your best. We all
Yeah.
need to do our best out there.
Yeah. And sometimes your best isn't even like it's the best with what you have,
Yeah.
because sometimes your best is like the best that you want to give, right? Like
Right.
I could be at 100%, but I'm giving 80 because it's the best for me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Totally.
that's
Yeah.
like you kind of finagle it to whatever you want best to be defined as.
Right.
So
Totally. All right. And the last question kind of goes along with this too, but it's more just like you have the microphone and you're standing in front of everybody in the whole world. What would you say to them?
what would I mean, what I'd want to say, I don't know if it would make an impact, considering what you said at the beginning of like, be kind, be good, be empathetic, be loving. But I can say it doesn't mean people would do it, right?
Totally.
um, but I think I just, um, I don't know the exact words I would say, but I can get really disheartened sometimes. Like there's some parts of the internet where I get into and I'm just like, whoa, these people exist. Like it can be really,
Yeah.
really, really hard to come across. Like I haven't been on Twitter for years because you can see some things that just like wreck you. And I'm
Totally.
like, I have never even dabbled in Reddit. It's not even worth
Yeah.
and
No.
and even on TikTok, which I just started, like it's just there's so many, it just it can be really scary and can be really demoralizing and it can really, really, really rip your soul to shreds. So whatever I would come up with to say, or what I would hope to say, would be something that would just like put a damper on that. Like it just feels like, I don't know, the world can be a really, really scary place. And I would try to use that opportunity to at least, I don't know, either get people to see it like in themselves, because I question the self-awareness of people who
Totally.
are propagating these messages and these ideals. Um, but if nothing else, like the people who experience it or see it and aren't those people but are still engaging with it, to realize that like cutting off the water source is what creates the drought. Like to just have them,
Yeah.
you know, see their role in it, not in terms of like take responsibility for it, but like see that their power to like stop this or to
Yeah.
like, I guess, make a difference or make a change. Because that really, I mean, if I had access to all almost 8 billion people, so we're about to hit 8 billion next week according to data scientists.
Yeah.
Uh that's the one thing I would really hope to get out of it, because
Yeah.
sometimes I wish we had no internet, so I just didn't know that certain things existed.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, yeah, it's very disheartening. And yeah, I think you're right with the self-awareness. And I just think there's so many times I see things and I'm just like, yeah, these people exist and a massive amount of them exist. And that's the scariest part. And it's,
I mean, I'm still traumatized from like a year and a half ago. I went into a coffee shop and someone asked me how I was doing, and I just stared at them, right? And I didn't like, I wasn't kind and nice to them. And I think about that all the time, right? So how can they just like, I don't know. I'm like, do you not, does it not keep you up at night? Like,
right.
I don't,
Clearly
I
not.
don't, ugh.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons I wanted to start doing the podcast like this was just like I shared a personal story, and then a friend of mine who I didn't even know that my story impacted him so deeply shared that it did affect him so deeply. And I was like, well, damn, we all have so much power in our stories, no matter what our stories are. And also, like, there's just so much hatred out there of other and different and fill in whatever descriptor. And it's like, you don't even know these people. Like, either leave people be or like get to know them, like one or the other. And so I was like, I love everybody. I love traveling. It's half the fun of traveling is meeting people from all over the world and different backgrounds and experiences and just hearing their stories. So I was like, I just want to like ask people to tell me the story of their lives and just hear from a few of the 8 billion people almost that are out there, because there's similarities, there's power, there's strengths, there's beauty, there's all of this in lives. And also just wanted to get that message out to people and be like, stop, just like stop what you're doing and like be humane for just
we are more similar than we are different. I think that's what
yes,
some anthropologists recently I read said, that like the consensus among like the anthropological community and academics was like the most important thing for us to know is that we are more similar than we are different.
Yeah.
And I was like, whoa, like that should be like a Pinterest quote, but it's also super insightful.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was speaking to one woman and she grew up in Africa, and she grew up in a farming community in Africa. And so she was talking about how when she sees combines, she thinks of home. And I was like, I grew up in cornfields of Ohio. And I think about, like, when I see combines, I think of home, and you probably do too because of Oklahoma or just like the Midwest. And it's like that connector that people just don't think about. It's like, it's such a cool common thread, and it's so basic that like something like a piece of farm equipment can connect all these different lives. And even people that don't think like us see the same thing.
And I know like we're wrapping this up, but I want to say to that point, something that I had an epiphany when I was in Paris, in that same way of like something reminds you of home, that a lot of my friends get annoyed because I often say like, this smells like Nigeria. This smells like like there's just certain smells that I associate with Nigeria. I just attached to some of my first experiences there when I was younger. And they're always like, but what is the smell? I'm like, I don't know what the smell is. I'm not sure where it comes from. I know it when I smell it, and it's very Nigerian.
Yeah.
When I was in Paris, I walked out of the airport, and my first thought was, it smells like Nigeria here. This is so weird. And when I realized, I'm pretty sure it's just diesel. Like, it's just like, it's like the smell of like the gas. Like, right, I grew up in a town like in Oklahoma that I didn't smell that often. So I associated it, and I didn't travel much. Or experience much of the world up until very recently. So I always associated that smell with Nigeria, and now realizing that it's a common smell in Paris, and it was because I was in a parking lot, I was like, oh, wow, these are really like a simple, small thing that really like this muscle memory or this olfactory memory that connects me to technically like almost every major area in the world.
And when you said that, my grandfather on my mother's side, he delivered gasoline for a bulk plant. And so I think, like, when you said diesel, I immediately saw my grandpa walking into his house when I was a kid because he came home smelling like gasoline all the time because he was delivering it every day. So like, it's so cool that like simple little things, and mine's vastly different than yours, but it's still like, we smell gasoline and most people are like, oof, but we have these special memories with it. It's there's so many of those that are just so neat that connect people. Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for hanging out and taking the time to chat with me.
And thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to kind of dig into a part of myself that I haven't given myself much space to explore in recent times.
And I enjoyed every second of hearing your story and your experiences. It was really lovely.
Thank you for listening to the Beautifully Human podcast. To hear more beautiful stories from beautiful humans, follow us on Spotify and rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at the Beautifully Human Podcast. Peace signs up.